Welcome to Spectator Television. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator, and I'm joined by Charles Moore, chairman of The Spectator, Daily Telegraph columnist, and of course, Margaret Thatcher's biographer. And Charles is bringing out, to mark the centenary of Margaret Thatcher's birth, a new one-volume edition of his authorised and landmark biography of Margaret Thatcher. And we're uniquely fortunate today to be joined by Peggy Noonan. Peggy was there at the White House, and her book detailing her experience as Ronald Reagan's speechwriter, the person who was the author and inspiration for some of the most historic words that president ever uttered, is here. Peggy, absolute pleasure to see you. Charles, lovely to see you again. And we're here obviously to discuss the Reagan-Thatcher relationship, the most important historic relationship, arguably, of the 20th century. Peggy, how much of an inspiration to Ronald Reagan was Margaret Thatcher?
Oh gosh, how much of an inspiration. I think Ronald Reagan was so relieved to meet her first in the 1970s and then govern with her. In the 80s, she was elected, she was made prime minister, I think, in 78. He was made president in 81. They governed together. I think Reagan was relieved that there was at least one other major world leader who was on the same page as him, that it was the leader of Great Britain was an extra gift, that they could work, they sort of, intuitive would be the wrong word, but they understood each other on a granular level of policy about which they were both very serious. Mrs. Thatcher was known to live in part for policy, but Reagan did too. The whole purpose of him was serious philosophical conservatism applied to the modern era. And I think Mrs. Thatcher was the same. Second, they were both political breakthrough artists. Thatcher rises and ends a sort of 40 or 50-year point of view or way of being. Reagan rises and ends the same in the United States. Both of them were very interested in economic matters. Of course, they wanted to reignite their nations. But on top of that, they looked at the Soviet Union, the main foreign policy and strategic challenge of their time, and they thought, we can handle that. Sweet words will not do that. Serious decisions and public candor will help us do that. So they were the same. They were partners in crime. They were fabulous, I think. Charles, I don't know how you see that.
I agree with all of that. Something you said, Peggy, I just expand on, because I realized later, actually, after I'd written the book, it's never happened before or since, which is that a two-term American president has the same British prime minister before he's elected, all the time he serves, and afterwards. So that is a uniquely long period to develop a relationship, and by great good luck, it existed already. They were friends in adversity, which is usually a stronger thing than in good times. And they first met in April 1975. She'd just become leader, and he had no office because he'd left the governorship of California, and he was trying to get and failing actually, to get the Republican nomination for 76.
That's right.
And so they could have got absolutely nowhere. It was perfectly possible when they met, they could have got absolutely nowhere, but they immediately clicked. And it was to do with ideological sympathy, and also, I think, a sort of slight outsider's understanding of the problem.
Yeah.
It didn't, when you're in charge of things, you tend to think things are going well. They weren't in charge of things, and they could see that they weren't going well. And They wanted to tell that to the American and British people.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I'd just say is that fascinatingly different temperaments, which were complementary rather than clashing. So Mrs. Thatcher always on the case, very serious, rushing around, busy, and talking. And President Reagan, much more relaxed, much more humorous, calm. And I think each liked the other. And I also think that partly of this was that each represented to the other. You may very well tell me I'm wrong about Reagan, but the archetype of the country they led. So she thought of Reagan as, it's to do with the actor quality. I think it's a sort of true American who actually almost embodies those sort of classic movie star American characteristics. And I think he thought of her as the perfect English lady with the cut glass accent and the very neat
I think
clothing
so.
of the sort of middle of the 20th century.
I
And
think so,
do you
and
think
it tickled each of them.
Yeah.
Yes, I do
And
think.
they each found one another attractive. I don't mean that there was sort of sexual chemistry particularly, but there was sort of...
But he was a big, masculine, calm American man.
Yeah.
And she was a busy, certain, conviction politician, which would have been thrilling for him because he was surrounded by other politicians who were driven by other things, not conviction. So what a delight for him. Also, I think you touch on something. Outsiderness is a position of advantage for a writer, for one who writes.
Yeah.
To be on the outside is to be able to see more clearly and speak more frankly. Outsiderness is a position of advantage for a political figure.
Yeah, absolutely. And she knew exactly what to do about that. The grocers, first of all, the outsider by her sex at the time, and outsider as the grocer's daughter.
Yes.
And a provincial girl, and he, yes, exactly.
Totally. And she came from, as a matter of fact, she had an advantage over Reagan in that Margaret Thatcher came from a very stable family with a successful local grocer dad who expanded his grocery to another grocery. Poor Ronald Reagan had parents he loved, and they loved him and his brother Moon, but Mom was a bit of an eccentric, kind of a Bible-thumping lady who enjoyed things like going to the local prison and trying to read the Bible to prisoners. That's very lovely. But Dad was more itinerant in his work, a shoe salesman, another kinds of salesman, alcoholic, and an embarrassment.
Yeah.
And boy, in the Midwest in the 1920s, you didn't want to be embarrassed by Dad.
No.
And also, I think Margaret Thatcher came up in a household, in a family that was rather tightly scheduled, rather rigorously kept together. Reagan and his brother were out running around at night in the dark at 8 p.m. when everybody else was home to dinner. So I think, I can't help but think they both sensed a certain sense of we were different, but we're rather alike, aren't we?
And there's a point there, which is that one of the great gifts of political leadership in a democracy is somehow never being captured by the machine of government. And I think both Reagan, and that's partly to do with their outsider qualities, but it's also a communicative gift. So whenever you heard Mrs. Thatcher talk or Reagan talk in public, you understood what they were saying. Whereas many prime ministers say things like, well, the report contains several clauses and blah, 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 and you've lost. And they always knew how to get the message through. And I think that's because, well, it's a natural gift, but also they instinctively identified with the human being, the voter, the forgotten man or woman or whatever you want to say, rather than the machine. And tremendously powerful form of leadership as a result.
I would only add that I think they both identified with normal nobodies. Mm-hmm. Most people are normal nobodies, and they had been normal nobodies.
And they both came to power against the wishes, essentially, of their party's establishments at a time when their countries were in crisis. So Margaret Thatcher faced the hostility of her predecessor, Edward Heath, the resistance of the wets within her own party, Jim Pryor, Ian Gilmore, and so on. Ronald Reagan, when he challenged for the presidential nomination in 1976, was an insurgent against Gerald Ford, and the traditional East Coast Yankee Republican establishment, the Rockefellers and so on, looked down their nose at him. Do you think that either of them, as outsiders and insurgents, could ever have got to those positions without the crisis circumstances of the 1970s?
Great question. Ronald Reagan would not have become president without 4 years of the ill luck and unsure leadership of Jimmy Carter before him, and the economic crisis reigning at the time, stagnation, high unemployment, high interest rates, high inflation. What a mess. On top of that, the Iran crisis. So that made America think, whoa, this is not working so well. In the first debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter seemed like the fellow talking about the clause in Bill 48, which proves that inflation is getting better. Reagan was like the normal American saying, I don't think it's getting better. And frankly, your life has not gotten any better, has it, in the past 4 years? So crisis for Reagan, yes. We must remember, those of us who are conservative say, Ronald Reagan, great man and great president. But in America in the 1970s, Ronald Reagan, nice sort of fella, movie star, TV star, and isn't he so tough on the Soviet Union that we'll all get nuked? So believe me, he needed the crisis to become Ronald Reagan. Mrs. Thatcher, you know better than I do, the economic, not only crisis, but a profound sense of malaise in England before she came up. And she uniquely said, there are answers to our problems. We must do this and this and this. And I believe this, and I will do it. And they looked at her and they thought, she's a woman with a plan. Woman is a little unusual, but she looks like she's tougher than the guys. Let's give it a shot. Yeah. That's how I read it.
Yes, and almost as important, perhaps as important as the economic stuff, was the Cold War stuff. So, and I think Reagan and she both thought about this a lot, about losing ground economically because of related to the Cold War and of course the threat of the Soviet Union, ideological, military, etc. And they really did care about it, and they thought about it way back. And Reagan had his experiences with communists and trade unions and all that sort of thing.
Yes.
And she was always fighting trade union extremism. And of course, the reason, as you know, why she's called the Iron Lady is because that was the insult thrown at her by the Soviet Red Army newspaper, which she then brilliantly adopted. And seeing that this, there couldn't be a greater compliment than that type of insult. And so they were, both of them, very much onto it. And I think it helps to explain, first of all, it's very important. But secondly, that shared thing meant that they could get through considerable difficulties in their own relationship related to this issue, because the most extraordinary thing about Thatcher and Reagan is that they had a massive basic disagreement about nuclear weapons, because Reagan, I think, truly believes that you should try to get rid of them. And she truly believes that you shouldn't, because she believed in deterrent theory. And she thought, these nasty guys have got them, we've got to have them. And that's the way we don't kill one another. Yeah. He thought the whole world can change and we can get rid of it. And so they basically disagreed about that. And therefore, she was worried by his strategic defense initiative, which was called Star Wars.
Yes.
But...
And what a key division between two people who work so well.
Yes. And so what's fascinating is not only that they disagree, but how they contained it, the disagreement. Because she realized that SDI, she wasn't happy with it, but she A, didn't want to upset the president, and B, she could see that it had one great virtue, which in her eyes, which is that it would frighten the Soviets.
Absolutely.
And she remained very nervous that Reagan, at the Reykjavik summit, she was terrified that he was going to give it away. Yeah. But she handled it cleverly. And I think Reagan understood that she was handling it this way and was happy with it. So he would give confirmation from time to time that anything that went from research to development would be done in agreement with the Allies, and sort of kept calm about it. And so actually, they absolutely didn't agree about this, but it never really came to a terrific bust-up. And that's because they had the ultimate trust, which is they both want the same thing, which is they want the Soviet Union, the evil empire, to be defeated, but without fighting. And that's what happened.
Friends give each other space and grace.
Yeah, that's...
And where were the other areas of tension in the relationship? Because you have two people who are ideologically aligned, who feel this kinship because of their background. You mentioned the area of nuclear disarmament. But there were also other areas, perhaps touching on the British Empire, and whether that was in the Falklands or in Grenada, where there were tensions, and partly because of their personalities, but partly also because America and Britain, even as their strong allies, are not identical in their world outlook.
That's right. Not identical in their history, not identical in their relation to the idea of colonial pasts. They had their tensions. To an American, it seemed to me, the greatest tension was over the Falklands, when I think Mrs. Thatcher, expected immediate and hearty Reagan-esque approval of her difficult and dramatic decision to fight. And if I'm remembering correctly, that hearty and immediate approval did not quite come, because in the Reagan White House, there were disagreements between those who said, keep out of this. Argentina, we've got good relations, let's not mess up our stuff with the generals. But again, the two of them, Reagan and Thatcher, massaged the problem, so it sort of went away.
The way the American system works, I think you make the point about the White House, is there are all these different pressures, even more than there are in the British government. And so you had some very hardline pro-Argentina, like Jean Kirkpatrick.
Yeah.
You had people in the middle.
He was the ambassador to the UN.
Yes.
You had the Secretary of State, Al Haig, who was sort of in the middle because he wanted to be the peacemaker and it was showing off to some extent, I would say, trying to sort of, I can sort this out. You had Reagan, who was basically sympathetic but cautious on the matter, but you had Cap Weinberger, the defense secretary, who was shoving us masses of kit all the time behind the scenes, right from the beginning, actually.
Yeah.
And intelligence and all the rest of it.
Yes.
And so in the end, I don't think it was much in doubt, but it did seem touch and go, because the whole sending of the task force could have collapsed if the wrong type of negotiations had started. And then people would have thought it's just not going to happen. Argentina will get away with it. There'll be some UN compromise. And there, the relationship with Reagan was very important. And she was able to speak to him on the phone and all that sort of thing, of course. There was another very funny factor, which was he was paying a state visit to Britain in June 1982, and this all kicked off in April. And he'd arranged, it had been arranged, he'd been invited to ride with the Queen at Windsor. And he was it's clear from the documentation and people I spoke to, that he was getting increasingly worried that he wouldn't be able to ride with the Queen at Windsor because of the Falklands War. And I definitely think that that this did rather affect his approach to the situation. He realized that partly it was a timing question. And so in the end, America gave full support. You get a very funny call from Reagan later on when he's still trying to, the British have got to the Falklands by now, but they haven't quite won. And he sort of makes a last effort to get a peaceful solution on the telephone, and she just blows him out of the water in on the phone. I mean, in a friendly way, but she says, we haven't gone all this way to, give in now, surrender, out of blah, blah, blah. And you can sort of, Reagan backing off and says, no, sure, Margaret, sure. And then he rides at Windsor, which of course he loves, and photographed with the Queen, which she did.
He rides horses.
Yes.
With the
Queen, and that's a marvellous scene, because the Queen, of course, very much disliked the idea of talking to the press, and indeed never did. And so you see her holding back on her horse, while Reagan goes forward on his, and he chats in his usual way. And she's sort of basically saying, "Come on," and anyway, it all worked beautifully. And then he was able to make the speech which he would have made anyway to the House of Parliament, but was really his great theory about winning the Cold War, but he was able to bring the Falklands into it because he could see we had virtually won and he had supported. And so Mrs. Thatcher could not have been more pleased. It was absolutely triumphant. And it sort of became that speech, the Royal Gallery speech, became the sort of template for the Reagan view of how we're going to win all this across the world. And so near disaster turned into triumph.
Which is what gifted politicians do.
Yes. It's always very close to the wire, isn't it? Just the other one was Grenada, the invasion of Grenada. And this, in personal terms, was more upsetting to Mrs. Thatcher than the Falklands, because she had felt betrayed by Reagan, because he didn't tell her that he was about to invade. And he rather indicated to her that he wasn't. He didn't.
And this is a Caribbean island, a Commonwealth country.
Yes. So the Queen is, and not just a Commonwealth country, but one of the Queen's realms. So the Queen was Queen of Grenada and America was invading it. So tricky situation, which America wasn't too bothered about because it needed to do what it felt it needed to do.
To pose a sort of Marxist coup.
Marxist sort of tin pot Marxism,
Yeah, which had become rather murderous,
thuggish.
Absolutely.
And normally in those circumstances, Mrs. Thatcher would be very supportive. But in those particular circumstances, with it being one of the realms and also being kept out of the loop, she was truly upset. And it nearly went off the rails because she was so upset that she gave a public interview at one point, which sort of broke it all out into the open again. And I do think that was to do with trust. And the telephone call that Reagan made to her to apologize is actually on tape. And it is marvelous because it's just like a 1940s film. She says, "If I were there, Margaret, I'd throw my hat through the door." And,
I remember.
And she said, "There's no need to do that," very stiffly. You can, I mean, she really did mind. And it took about 6 months of mending. But in the end, realpolitik prevailed, the friendship returned, and she really, really helped him in personal terms with the Iran-Contra deal. Because scandal, because she very wisely refused Britain to get involved in Iran-Contra, which they were asked to do. But what she did was she simply came to America, she went on television all around the place, ate up Leslie Stahl on the television and said, "You've got a great president, you're a great country, what's all this fuss about? Come on." And Reagan was just
a very dramatic moment in media, a key moment that started to change things a little bit. And Leslie Stahl, a close friend of mine, was quite taken aback by Thatcher on that in that moment. So I've got a theory. Tell me if there's anything to my theory. The special relationship, quote unquote. We've been talking about it for almost a century. We can go back to Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill and their fabulous work together in World War II, and Churchill coming to, they had private nicknames for each other. Churchill briefly lived in FDR's White House. They were, in my judgment, two essentially cool, as in coldish, characters, but they enjoyed each other very much. And cigarettes, cigars, and a few brandies must have happened in the evening, and that's just fine. After that, we have John F. Kennedy and Macmillan, a relationship that I think is not so much paid attention to. I never see any, I would see it in biographies, but there's no journalism on it, or very little. But JFK, whose father had suffered a stroke early on in his presidency, I think came to see Harold Macmillan, British Prime Minister, as something of a father figure. I'm making a little leap there, but it's possible. He loved to talk to Macmillan by phone. He liked to divulge some personal information. He loved to get on the phone and ask him what's new with the Profumo affair. Jack Kennedy could not hear enough about Profumo. You jump ahead now, Reagan and Thatcher, a true philosophical, political, and yet personal relationship, which we've been discussing. Then I go to, so what the heck happened with George W. Bush and Tony Blair? And then I think, I am afraid that George W. Bush needed Blair because he needed Europe for Afghanistan and Iraq. And I fear that Tony Blair, with a lively sense of the show business of history, thought, if I join with George so closely and we do our great alliance stuff, I will be as great a figure as FDR and Churchill and Jack and Mac and Mrs. Thatcher and Reagan, that there was, under Blair, there came to be a self-consciousness about the special relationship that in the end did not serve Blair or even Bush well. What do you make of that as a theory?
I think it's correct. And I think that the special relationship undoubtedly exists. There are a variety of factors that mean that Britain and America are natural allies, cooperate in times of conflict, share intelligence as a brother and sister. However, I think it is often underappreciated that there are strains both in the United States and in the United Kingdom that mean that while they're natural allies, it's not the case that they are joined at the hip. They may be brother and sister, but they're not Siamese twins.
Right.
And it is the case that there will be particular reasons why the US and the UK might take different views of particular issues. And it is also the case that there is an understandable strain in American thinking that Britain patronizes the United States, and an understandable strain in British thinking that American leaders can often be unduly idealistic about the state of the world. And looking at, for example, Sam Tannenhouse's biography of William F. Buckley, which came out this summer, William F. Buckley, the great articulator of American conservatism. Bill Buckley, who was the great anti-communist, and would have thought the natural sort of, sympathetic figure for Britain, was someone who grew up hating Britain and arguing that America should stay out of the Second World War. And similarly, Margaret Thatcher's arguable guru, Enoch Powell, not in every respect, but in economics, was someone who always maintained that Britain's interests and America's diverged, and that Britain was an imperial power and America wanted to see that empire eclipsed. So the special relationship, I think, is of enormous value. But I'm sure that both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan would have said, don't romanticize it.
Yes.
Make sure that this is a friendship and an alliance with a purpose, rather than simply an ornament to celebrate. I don't know if you agree, Charles.
Well, I do, but she did romanticize it as well, and was very good at doing so. And that she got from Churchill, really.
Yes.
So Churchill, of course, was driven by dire necessity in the war,
yes.
which he did very, very well. I actually think the personal relation between Thatcher and Reagan was better than FDR and Churchill, and it went on for longer, and there were fewer tensions. But you're absolutely right, Peggy, that FDR and Churchill enjoyed one another's company, and that was obviously key. I think she knew she didn't. Of course, she minded very much, because she's that sort of person, that Britain had less power in the world than once upon a time. But that didn't drive her to be anti-American, as it sometimes does. It drove her to be drove her to be pro-American, because of what she believed, and again, a Churchill phrase, in English-speaking peoples.
Yes.
I think Bismarck said once that the simple, important thing to understand is that the Americans speak English. And
I do think it comes down to that.
Yes, and
we came from you, and we speak the same language.
Yeah,
and we are democracies.
Yes, so sometimes it gets lost in translation because there is the American and British, but on the whole, it works. And she thought, let's just, instead of sort of fussing about it, which the left tended to do, make the most of it. And she genuinely loved her visits to America, which she had already paid before she became famous. And she didn't really like her visits to continental Europe very much.
No.
And
certainly not to Germany, where she'd come across Helmut Kohl stuffing his face with cream cakes rather than...
Yes, exactly. And she bought into the American dream very much. She thought, this is a great country where people, if they want to do something, they can try hard and they'll do it. And all of that she really believed. Very interesting point you make about Blair, Peggy, which is correct. But I think he was a bit more sensible about it than perhaps is being implied, because remember, what he had to do was deal with his left. And he was always determined not to be the prisoner of his left.
Yes.
And therefore, if you came down to having to go one way in the road or the other, you had to go, in Blair's mind, if you like, to the right, not the left. So he knew that if he didn't support the United States over 9/11 and all the rest of it, the Tories would immediately say, look, in the end, Labour can never be relied to work with our greatest ally.
Yes, I see.
We're the only serious party, the Conservatives, which are sort of big enough to deal with these questions. And Blair knew that he couldn't let that happen, and he couldn't become the prisoner of the left by starting to, like continental leaders did, starting to attack George Bush. So I think it wasn't easy for him, and he made the right decision. However, it was a slightly bogus relationship, because the same type of ideological sympathy wasn't there.
Yeah.
And therefore I think it was quite a good relationship, but it was sort of a bit fragile. And it wasn't a creative relationship. It didn't lead to You know, I
It
can
never
remember you.
seemed to me serious in the
Yeah.
way the other ones
Yes,
did.
and behind all that, and I'm sure you'll remember this from the time, and I remember it very much from my first visits to America in the 80s, that behind all that was therefore masses of journalistic, intellectual discussion, policy discussion, where you go to conferences there, they come here, and we all wanted to share these ideas about all sorts of economic reforms, social reforms,
Yes.
educational reforms, détente or not détente, etc. Massive conversation, constant conversation, which is very stimulated by the Reagan-Thatcher relationship. And that didn't happen with the Bush-Blair relationship.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? Speaking of this special relationship, see if this rings a bell for either or both of you. I remember spending some time with Mrs. Thatcher at the home of a mutual friend 1, 2, or 3 years after she had left power. We were at a beach, at a lovely mansion on a beach, and every day we chatted just about history and politics. And she told me, with regard to the special relationship, part of the special job and purpose of Great Britain was to look and see the bad ideas of the continent of Europe that were coming westward and to grab them, take them, stop them, maybe absorb them, but keep them from going in full force west to the United States.
Yes.
Does that ring any bells for you?
It does. And it therefore meant she had a unique position within the American administration, you could almost say, under Reagan, because she was the only one really, first of all, the only foreigner they really trusted. Secondly, she appealed to both sides within the administration because she appealed to the hawks because she was so strong on Soviet Union. But she also had some more European type ideas about certain restraints, which rather appealed to the less hawkish. So she got on very well with George Shultz as well as with Kat Weinberger. So you get this pattern in the administration in which in order to get something past the president, senior aides and secretaries of state invoke Mrs. Thatcher. So they say, Mr. President, Mrs. Thatcher thinks that blah, blah, blah. And
he'd perk right up.
And she could play it both ways. I mean, she could do it hawkishly or dovishly. And therefore, actually, this is why George Bush Sr. Pushed her out, rather, because he felt too much had been given to Mrs. Thatcher under the Reagan administration. And she definitely suffered from that. And maybe he was right from a point of view of American interests. Maybe they had actually got too close.
I thought she was saying to me, Marxism came and it bopped over from those crazy Europeans and it came to my country.
Yes.
And we did it too, but we absorbed it to an extent that when it went to you, you didn't get it full force. You got liberalism. You know what I mean?
Yes,
you didn't become
it's sort of like,
sick with Marxism the way England did for a while.
It's like sort of second order COVID in America.
Yes.
First order in Britain.
Exactly. We provide inoculation. The personal lives of both were affected by, inevitably, assassination attempts they both faced, a lone gunman in Reagan's case, the IRA in Margaret Thatcher's. And they also famously had extraordinarily strong relationships with their wife and husband. As private individuals, do you think that there are parallels between how both coped with power and any lessons for today from how both of them exhibited that leadership style, but also drew strength from their private lives?
Well, it's so obvious to say they both respected the show business of politics, but they were not about show business. They accepted show business as something you had to do in order to have a successful modern presidency, but they didn't get into it to be in showbiz.
No.
They got into it for serious reasons. I would say to young political figures, Reagan and Thatcher, first of all, they identified with the normal nobodies of life while having no illusions about not having risen very high. But they still knew how people thought because it was the way they thought. They respected their voters. They spoke to them with clarity, simplicity, When Mrs. Thatcher was explaining why she would have to go, she felt she had to go into the Falklands as a matter of international law and to a degree British pride, she didn't give you big flowery, jerky phrases or make-believe words. She was direct. She was direct and simple. That is how I experienced her.
Yeah.
When Ronald Reagan looked at the world and said, for 50 years we've been going blah, blah, blah about the Soviet Union. I'm going to tell you what the Soviet Union really is. I'm going to explain to you that it's quite wicked and it is an empire that means to expand. I'm going to tell you all about that. And then I'm going to tell you what I think we can do about it strategically and what our intention is. It was so clear. Clarity matters. I don't mean there is a flatness to political oratory now, if it can be called oratory. I don't even know what to call it. Oratory is too nice a word. But there is a flatness to political communication now that I think is connected to dumb, simple internet stuff that never gets to the heart of any matter, never deals seriously with any matter. Somebody told me the other day, I've been here since Monday, and I had nothing but wonderful political and journalistic talks. And somebody told me that in the House of Commons, they're starting to use AI to write their speeches. And I had a depressing thought. The depressing thought, oh, good, that will make them better. That is a horrifying thought.
Yes.
But there is, I don't know. Life is simpler than we think. You can pay $1 million a year to some supposed communications guru, and they're going to tell you about strong words and active verbs and all that crap. None of it is true. Keep in mind what Edith Wharton said. Edith Wharton, the great novelist of the early 20th century, she thought a lot about writing while being a writer. And she said, there's a funny thing I've noticed. When you read the love letters of geniuses, you realize they're exactly like the love letters of dunces. It is, I love you, I want you, I care about you. The way you looked under the lights that time when the snow was snowing. She said, it's all simple, it's all the same. It's simple, it's direct, and because you mean it, you mean it, you are in love. You don't need fancy, jerky words. So I would remember in politics what she noticed in love letters. Mean it, say it clear and simple.
Yes, and both the stories of both our subjects we're discussing were a classic example of how politics should be simple but can't be easy. So because they had huge amount of strife and problems, but there was that great simplicity. And Peggy mentioned show business and their attitude to show business, and I think very rightly, and how they knew they had to do it, but they weren't trapped by it, and they therefore understood the good side of show business, which is the power of symbols. That you can see something very clearly. Gay Gaines was a hostess who often entertained Mrs. Thatcher, and she told me that
I saw Mrs. Thatcher at her home once.
Yes, and she told me that whenever Mrs. Thatcher came to stay, she always had a black dress at the bottom of the suitcase in case Reagan died when she was there, and she was going to make the speech, which had been agreed to make the speech at Reagan's funeral, and so she was ready. And she'd prepared the speech, and by the time she delivered it, her mental powers were declining, so she'd already recorded it. When she did deliver it, she didn't deliver it. She came to the funeral, but wasn't well enough to deliver it. So had this curious experience of Margaret Thatcher sitting in the congregation, watching her own video speech in praise of Reagan. But that was so carefully thought through, and what she said in that funeral was so very direct and simple as Peggy says it should be. And it had a nice touch because as well as the big point that he was rescuing the world for freedom, she said something nice about how he was champion of the great cause of cheering us all up. She got
lovely.
Yes,
that was lovely.
So true, and not one of her gifts really. And though so ill and frail, not only did she go to Washington National Cathedral, she then got on Air Force One and crossed to I think is it the Santa Barbara Hills thing?
Yes.
Where the
To Simi Valley,
Simi Valley,
California,
yes.
where Reagan would be buried at the Reagan Library.
Yeah.
She, after Mrs. Thatcher was not well, she was a woman of age. She got to the U.S. Capitol in time for Ronald Reagan's body to be received there and lay in state there. Immediately after, she went, as you say, to the funeral, was with the Reagan family. Immediately after, got on a plane, probably Air Force Two, stayed throughout the flight in her high heels with her hat next to her, got through that transcontinental flight, got to Simi Valley in California, went through the funeral, wept at the funeral. This was a woman late in age who was not well, and who did that because she loved Ronnie and Nancy and wanted to show her love. How often among world leaders does that happen?
Yes, and it was reciprocated because it was, of course, Reagan who expressed the wish that she should speak at his funeral, and it had never happened before that a foreign leader had spoken at a presidential funeral. So it cemented really what we're talking about.
Charles Moore, Peggy Noonan, thank you both very much. Thank you.